In this pandemic, I keep hearing people say that we are living in unprecedented times. Well, yes, but, in some ways it is like wartime. There is danger and an uncertain outcome. We have had pandemics before. The so-called Spanish flu epidemic of 1918-19 killed more people than the First World War itself. We experience destructive terrorist incidents from time to time, particularly in London, but closer to home last week in Reading. And people say life will never be the same. And yet after a few days, life does go on, more or less as before. Londoners in particular are resilient. And before the last century, we have stories of great plagues, of famines, of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis. And despite great loss of life and maybe people moving from one place to another, life does go on. Very differently, but life does go on. We have been studying some major events in the life of Ruth and her family over the last 3 Sundays. First of all, famine in the normally fertile Bethlehem area sends Elimelech and Naomi off as refugees to Moab with their 2 sons. In their 10 or so years there, the sons marry local girls, but then Elimelech dies, and then the 2 sons. Naomi decides to return to her native Bethlehem, hearing that the famine has ended, and is accompanied there by one of her 2 widowed daughters-in-law, Ruth. We are reading here of events that occurred something like 3,000 years ago, in the Iron Age or Bronze Age eras. So clearly, things were very different then from how we do things today. In particular, personal morality and sexual ethics were very different. It was a time of polygamy, of a strong patriarchy, very much a male-dominated society. So we need to look carefully at the story of Ruth and her family to see what it holds for us today. What is clear is that in that society, women didn't take too many decisions for themselves. So it's instructive to look at the decisions that the women in this story did take. With her husband and sons dead, Naomi decided to go back to her roots, to Bethlehem. She would fall back on old loyalties and rely on her family and contacts there, rather than on what her adopted home of Moab could provide. She released her daughters-in-law of any obligations to her. Go back to your own people. In week 3, the 3 words describing Naomi were empty, determined, hopeful. Orpah does as Naomi suggests. She does go back to her family. She was described as grieving, confused, expectant. But Ruth makes her decision to stay with Naomi. A decision relating to a new loyalty, of love and care for her husband's mother, and also loyalty to the Hebrew God into whose people she has married. Indeed, loyal, loving, and courageous. In chapter 2, Ruth is seen as hard-working, brave, and appreciative, as she works in the fields to provide for herself and her mother-in-law. She comes under the care of Boaz, valiant, protective, and compassionate. And then we had the very interesting chapter 3 last week. Whether we read that as Naomi scheming to get a good marriage for Ruth, or Ruth behaving scandalously to ensnare Boaz, or people just caught up doing what seemed right in the conventional morality of that time, we see Ruth exhibiting vulnerability, trust, and bravery, and Boaz responding with respect and kindness. He sends Ruth home before light to protect her reputation. Or his? No, probably hers. Even in modern times, the man is just a Jack the Lad, whereas the girl is maybe seen as a bit of a slut. But as everything has happened on the threshing room floor, he gives her as much of the threshed barley as she can conveniently carry. But whatever Boaz's thoughts about Ruth, he is a man of the law. He knows that even if he is willing to act as her kinsman redeemer, there is another man who is closer and has a prior claim, so that must be respected.